trapped inside the darkened school as a coastal storm howls outside. Meredith Carlisle stares at the monitor in horror while the electronic emergency shutters hiss shut, locking her in with a killer. Her nursing license is gone, her son is branded a criminal, and now a computer cable is tightening around her throat, cutting off her air as she claws at the hands of the man she once trusted. Through the haze of suffocating lungs, she watches the screen display a 99% progress bar, a forged confession that will frame her for cyber terrorism and ruin her life forever. As the final percentage clicks over, Meredith doesn't reach for the keyboard. She reaches for a manual defibrillator. "Clear," she gasps, the smell of ozone and burnt circuitry filling the air as she prepares to surge 10,000 volts into a system that wasn't designed to survive. The police sirens are screaming just outside the steel-reinforced doors. But they aren't coming to save her. They're coming to arrest a woman who has already lost everything. The only question is whether she can turn a death trap into a broadcast booth before the oxygen in her brain runs out. The fluorescent lights of the Charleston ER hummed like a swarm of angry bees, their glow bouncing off the linoleum as Meredith Carlisle peeled off her blood-stained gloves. The scent of antiseptic clung to her skin, sharp and sterile. But beneath it lingered the metallic tang of the trauma case she'd just closed. Another kid. Another gunshot wound, another mother's scream echoing in her ears. She rubbed her temples, the pressure behind her eyes threatening to split her skull open. Her shift was supposed to end at 7, but the clock on the wall mocked her, the second hand ticking toward 8 with a mechanical indifference. She reached into the pocket of her wrinkled scrubs, her fingers brushing against a crumpled photo of Caleb at 8 years old, grinning toothlessly. That memory felt a lifetime away. Her phone buzzed against her hip, a sharp, insistent vibration that signaled a break in the fragile peace of the locker room. Meredith's fingers fumbled with the screen, the blue light stinging her tired eyes. The notification was from the school district's automated portal. Urgent. Parent meeting requested. Student, Caleb Carlisle. Status, expelled. The words didn't make sense. She blinked, waiting for the blur to sharpen, but the message remained the same. Hate speech. Immediate action required. Her breath hitched, a cold stone forming in the pit of her stomach. Caleb? The boy who spent his weekends coding open-source software for charities. The boy who stuttered when he had to order pizza over the phone. It was impossible. She grabbed her keys, the metal biting into her palm as she marched toward the exit, her mind already triaging the crisis. The drive to the high school was a blur of humid Charleston air and the scent of magnolias. But when Meredith pulled into the parking lot, the atmosphere shifted from summer heat to something predatory. A crowd had gathered near the front steps, students mostly, but their faces were distorted by a collective, ugly energy. They held their phones aloft like weapons, the screens glowing as they recorded a central figure hunched in the middle of the swarm. Meredith killed the engine, her pulse roaring in her ears. She saw the flash of a dark hoodie, the familiar slump of shoulders that tried to take up as little space as possible. It was Caleb. The crowd was chanting something, a rhythmic, ugly pulse of sound that hit her chest like a physical blow. Racist! Racist! She watched as a girl in a varsity jacket shoved him, the force of it sending Caleb stumbling back against a brick pillar. He didn't fight back. He just clutched his backpack to his chest like a shield, his eyes fixed on the ground. The humiliation was being broadcast in real time to 1,000 different feeds. Meredith's door flew open before she realized she'd moved. The heat hit her like a wall, but she didn't feel it. She only felt the desperate, white-hot need to reach her son. She marched toward the mob, her shoulders squared, her storm-gray eyes darkening with a ferocity that usually only surfaced when a patient was crashing on the table. The crowd didn't part easily. Meredith had to use her elbows, shoving through the press of sweaty teenagers and the smell of cheap body spray. "Move," she commanded, her voice low and rough, the tone she used to clear a trauma bay. A few students recoiled, startled by the intensity of the woman in blood-flecked scrubs. But others lingered, their phones still tracking Caleb's every flinch. She reached him and grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into the fabric of his sweatshirt. He looked up, his face pale and eyes wide with a startled, deer-like terror. Without a word, she pivoted, pulling him toward the heavy oak doors of the administration wing. She bypassed the main lobby, where more onlookers lingered, and ducked into a small, glass-walled private office that belonged to a counselor she'd met once during a PTA meeting. She slammed the door and turned the lock, the click echoing in the sudden, vacuum-like silence of the room. Outside, the muffled shouts of the students continued. But here, the air was still, smelling of old paper and dust. Meredith turned to Caleb, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch his face. He flinched, then slumped into a chair, his gangly limbs folding awkwardly. He looked smaller than his 16 years, a child caught in a storm he couldn't comprehend. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. "Talk to me. What is this?" "The school. They sent a notice about hate speech. Online posts." Caleb shook his head violently, his dark curls flopping into his eyes. He pushed them back with the heel of his hand, a nervous tic that had worsened over the last year. "I didn't do it, Mom," he gasped, his voice cracking. "I swear. I was at the hospital. I was doing my volunteer hours in the lab. I didn't even have my phone on me. They're saying these things, these horrible, disgusting things, and they have my name on them. But it wasn't me." He looked up at her, his brown eyes swimming with tears. "You have to believe me. I would never write those things. You know I wouldn't." Meredith watched him, her medical mind looking for the tells of a lie, the touching of the earlobe, the shifting gaze. But Caleb was steady, his terror directed outward at the world that had suddenly turned on him. She felt a familiar, cold calculation settle over her. If he was at the hospital, there would be a record. There was always a record. "I believe you," she said, her voice sharpening into a clinical edge. "And if you weren't on your phone, we can prove it. We're going back to the ER, right now." The return to the hospital felt different this time. The ER, usually her sanctuary, now felt like a repository of the truth she desperately needed to extract. She led Caleb through the ambulance bay, bypassing the triage desk where her coworkers were busy with the evening rush. She found a terminal in the back of the records department, a quiet corner away from the prying eyes of the nursing staff. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, entering her credentials with a practiced rhythm. She pulled up the volunteer logs, the digital ledger that tracked every badge in and badge out for the student assistants. She opened a side window on the monitor, pulling up the screenshots of the hate speech posts that had been circulated by the school board. The timestamps were clear: 4:14 p.m., 4:22 p.m., and 4:45 p.m. She cross-referenced them with the hospital's internal server logs. At 4:14 p.m., Caleb's badge had been used to access the supply room on the third floor. At 4:22 p.m., he had been logged into the terminal in the pathology lab, assisting Dr. Aris with a slide count. At 4:45 p.m., he was still there. He hadn't touched a personal device. He hadn't even been on the school's network. "You were offline," Meredith breathed, the relief washing over her like a cool wave. "Caleb, look. You were in the lab during every single one of these posts. You couldn't have sent them. It's an airtight alibi." She tapped the screen, the blue light reflecting in her eyes. The evidence was right there, written in the unassailable logic of the hospital's security system. Caleb leaned in, his breath hitching as he saw the rows of data. For a moment, the weight seemed to lift from his shoulders, his posture straightening just a fraction. But the reprieve was short-lived. As they exited the records office, heading back toward the parking lot to take this evidence to the principal, they found the exit blocked. It wasn't students this time. A group of adults, 4 or 5 of them, stood near the automatic doors of the hospital lobby. Meredith recognized one of them. Diane, a woman who had once been the PTA president, her face now a mask of righteous fury. Beside her stood a man Meredith didn't know, a large, thick-necked individual in a security polo shirt. They weren't there for medical care. They were waiting. "There he is," Diane shouted, her voice echoing off the sterile walls. "The little monster. You think you can just hide in here after what you said about our kids?" The group surged forward, their footsteps heavy on the linoleum. Meredith stepped in front of Caleb, her arm out like a guardrail. "This is a hospital," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You need to back away. Now, we aren't going anywhere until that laptop is handed over," the man in the polo shirt growled. He stepped toward Caleb, his hand reaching out to grab the strap of the boy's backpack. "We know he's got the evidence on there. We saw him deleting things in the parking lot." "He wasn't deleting anything," Meredith snapped. She shoved the man's hand away, the physical contact sending a jolt of adrenaline through her. "Back off, Greg. I'm not telling you again." The man, Greg, didn't back off. He lunged, his fingers catching the edge of Caleb's laptop sleeve. Caleb let out a sharp, panicked cry, pulling back, but Greg was stronger. Meredith didn't think. She acted. She used the heel of her palm to strike Greg's forearm, a technique she'd seen the hospital security use a dozen times on violent patients. The man grunted, his grip loosening just enough for Meredith to yank the laptop away and shove it into Caleb's arms. "Go! To the car!" she hissed at Caleb. She didn't wait for him to move. She grabbed his hoodie and began to plow through the group. Diane tried to block her path, screaming about accountability and justice. But Meredith didn't stop. She used her shoulder to force a gap, her steps purposeful and heavy. She felt a hand tug at her hair, a sharp sting of pain. But she ignored it, pushing Caleb through the sliding doors and into the humid night air. They ran for the car, the sound of the vigilantes' shouts fading behind them as the doors hissed shut. They sat in the car for a moment, the engine idling, both of them breathing in ragged, shallow gasps. Meredith's hands were shaking on the wheel. She needed more than just a volunteer log. She needed to know how this had happened. She thought of Dolores, the IT secretary at the school district office. Dolores was a woman who lived for the rules, but hated bullies even more. Meredith put the car in gear and drove toward the administrative building, her mind racing. The district office was nearly empty, the halls smelling of floor wax and stale coffee. Dolores was still there, hunched over a glowing monitor in a cubicle that looked like a fortress of manila folders. She looked up as Meredith and Caleb approached, her cat-eye glasses sliding down her nose. She didn't ask why they were there. She'd clearly seen the news. "I shouldn't be doing this, Meredith," Dolores rasped, her voice like gravel. "If the board finds out I'm pulling server logs for a student under investigation, I'm done. 20 years, gone." "They're going to ruin him, Dolores," Meredith said, leaning over the counter. "Look at him. Does he look like a cyber terrorist to you?" "He was at the hospital. I have the logs. Someone used his account." Dolores sighed, a deep, weary sound. She turned back to her computer, her fingers clicking rhythmically. Suspicious remote login, she muttered after a few minutes. Happened at 4:10 p.m., right before the first post. Someone bypassed the school's firewall using a high-level administrative credential. They didn't just hack Caleb, they walked through the front door. She hit a key, and a printer in the corner began to whir, spitting out a single sheet of paper. Meredith grabbed the page. It was a technical log, a string of numbers and codes that meant nothing to her until she saw the final line. Originating IP, 172.116.254.1. Her heart stopped. She knew that sequence. It was the static IP for the nursing station in Trauma Bay 2. Her workstation. The air in the small office suddenly felt very thin. The realization hit her like a physical blow, a sickening twist in her gut. Whoever had framed Caleb hadn't just used a random computer. They had used hers. They had tied the crime to both of them, a perfect loop of shared guilt. Meredith? Dolores asked, her brow furrowing. What is it? It's me, Meredith whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the AC. The IP, it's my desk at the ER. They're making it look like I did it for him. Or with him. She looked at Caleb, who was staring at the paper with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. The trap hadn't just been set. It had already snapped shut. The weight of the discovery followed them home, like a physical presence. Meredith tried to stop at the Piggly Wiggly on the way, needing something simple. Milk, bread, a distraction. But when she swiped her debit card, the screen flashed a cold, clinical red. Declined. She tried again, her face heating up as the teenage cashier watched with a mix of pity and boredom. Declined. Contact financial institution. She stepped aside, her hands trembling as she pulled up her banking app. The balance read 0, not because the money was gone, but because the account was administrative hold. They froze everything. She muttered to Caleb as they walked back to the car, empty-handed. The school board or the police. They're treating this like a criminal conspiracy. When they pulled into their driveway, the house looked the same. The faded blue siding, the rocking chairs on the porch. But as soon as Meredith touched the smart lock on the front door, something was wrong. The lock didn't beep its usual friendly tone. It shrieked, a high-pitched, mechanical wail that echoed through the quiet street. The door clicked open, then shut, then open again. The bolt sliding back and forth with a frantic, rhythmic thud, thud, thud. Inside, the air was stifling. Meredith checked the smart thermostat in the hallway. The digital display was glowing a bright, angry orange. 100 degrees. The AC unit was silent, but the furnace was roaring, sending waves of thick, dry heat through the vents. "Mom, look," Caleb whispered, pointing to the living room. The smart TV had turned itself on. It wasn't showing a channel. The screen was filled with rolling green code, a waterfall of data that moved too fast to read. Then it stopped. A single line appeared in the center of the black screen. "Is it hot in here?" Meredith felt a surge of pure, primal terror. This wasn't just a hack. It was a violation. Her home, the only place where she felt she could protect Caleb from the ghost of his father's mistakes, had been turned into a weapon. She grabbed a kitchen chair and jammed it under the front door handle, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Caleb, get your laptop. Stay in the kitchen. Don't touch any of the smart devices." She spent the next hour on the phone, trying to reach the school board members, the principal, anyone who would listen. But every call went to voicemail, or was met with a cold, scripted response from an assistant. The board has no comment on ongoing disciplinary matters involving Ms. Carlyle and her son. They had already been tried and convicted in the Court of Administrative Opinion. The glitches in the house escalated. The microwave in the kitchen suddenly hummed to life, the turntable spinning empty while the light inside flickered like a dying star. A framed photo of Caleb and Meredith at the beach, one of the few they had where she was actually smiling, suddenly slid off the mantelpiece. It didn't just fall. It seemed to be pushed, shattering against the hearth with a sharp, violent crack. Meredith stood in the center of the living room, her hands clenched at her sides. She felt like she was back in the ER, watching a patient bleed out while the equipment failed. But she wasn't a nurse right now. She was a mother, and she was being hunted. The sound of the front door splintering was louder than she expected. It wasn't the rhythmic clicking of the lock anymore. It was the sound of a heavy boot meeting wood. Meredith spun around, her eyes wide, as a man forced his way into the foyer. He was dressed in a cheap suit that didn't fit his broad, scarred shoulders, and he held a manila envelope in one hand, like a prop. "Meredith Carlyle?" the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I'm a process server. I have an emergency injunction regarding the digital evidence in your possession." Meredith didn't look at the envelope. She looked at his hands. They were calloused, his knuckles scarred from years of something that wasn't office work. He moved with a predatory grace, his eyes scanning the room, landing on Caleb, who was huddled near the kitchen table with the laptop clutched to his chest. "You're not a process server," Meredith said, her voice dropping into that dangerous, low register. "Get out of my house." The man didn't leave. He stepped further into the room, his gaze fixed on the laptop. "The school board wants that hardware, kid. Hand it over, and this all goes away. No more heat, no more noise, just the laptop." He lunged toward the kitchen. Caleb scrambled back, tripping over a chair, but the man was faster. He caught Caleb by the shoulder, his fingers digging into the boy's collar. "Give it to me." Meredith didn't hesitate. She ran to her nursing bag, which was sitting on the counter. She didn't reach for her phone or her keys. She reached for her heavy-duty trauma shears, the ones designed to cut through leather boots and denim jeans. She gripped the handles, the cold steel a familiar weight, and swung. The blades caught the man across the back of his hand as he reached for the laptop. He let out a sharp, guttural cry, releasing Caleb and clutching his hand. Blood, bright, arterial red, began to bloom against his white shirt. He looked at Meredith, his flat blue eyes wide with shock. He hadn't expected the nurse to fight back. "I said, get out!" Meredith screamed. She stepped between him and Caleb, the shears held out like a dagger. She knew exactly where the major veins were. She knew how much pressure it would take to sever a tendon. And the man could see it in her eyes. He backed away, his breath coming in ragged snarls. He didn't say another word. He turned and fled through the broken door, leaving a trail of red droplets on the linoleum. Meredith stood there, her chest heaving, her hands shaking so hard she almost dropped the shears. "Mom?" Caleb whispered from the floor. She didn't answer. She walked over to where the man had dropped his legal envelope. Inside, there was no injunction. There was only a single business card with a digital authorization code scrawled on the back. A code she recognized from the school's IT logs. It was the administrative credential for Eris Thorne, the computer science teacher. The man who had sat in their living room 2 days ago, drinking tea and promising to help Caleb navigate the technicalities of the expulsion. Meredith felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over her. Thorne wasn't their ally. He was the architect. He had used his access to bridge the gap between the school and the hospital, and now he was using his power to erase the trail. She walked over to the TV, which was still flickering with code. "He's not trying to help us, Caleb," she said, her voice steady now. "He's trying to kill the evidence, and he's doing it from inside the school." She looked at the laptop. A notification popped up on the screen, a direct message from an encrypted account. "You should have taken the deal, Meredith. Now, it's not just the school, it's everything." The next morning brought a fresh layer of ruin. Meredith was sitting at the kitchen table, the shattered glass from the night before still swept into a pile in the corner, when her phone chimed. It wasn't a text. It was an official email from the South Carolina Board of Nursing. Notice of immediate license suspension. She read the words twice, her mind refusing to process the clinical finality of them. Reason: allegations of unauthorized access to sensitive patient records and involvement in cybercriminal activity. Thorne hadn't just framed Caleb. He had planted leaked files on her workstation, making it look like she was selling patient data on the dark web. In one stroke, he had stripped away her livelihood, her reputation, and her ability to fight back legally. "He's isolating us," she whispered, the realization sinking in. She looked at Caleb, who was pale and silent, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he tried to trace the source of the message from the night before. "He's making it so no one will believe us, even if we show them the truth." "Mom, I found something," Caleb said, his voice small but urgent. He turned the laptop toward her. On the screen was a rhythmic pulse of data, a steady blip, blip, blip on a digital graph. "It's a heartbeat signal. Thorne's software. It's not just sitting on our network. It's communicating with a physical server, a master hub." "Where?" Caleb adjusted the map on the screen. The red dot was centered exactly on the high school campus. The computer science lab, his private office. It's the only place with a dedicated high-speed line that could handle this kind of traffic. If we want the original logs, the ones he hasn't been able to forge yet, they're on that server. Meredith looked out the window. The sky over Charleston was bruising, a deep, sickly purple that signaled an incoming coastal storm. The wind was already picking up, tossing the Spanish moss on the live oaks like tattered spirits. The final school board hearing was scheduled for 6 o'clock that evening. If they didn't have the evidence by then, Caleb would be blacklisted from every university in the country, his future erased before it had even begun. "We have to go," Meredith said. She grabbed her raincoat and her nursing bag, which still held the blood-stained trauma shears. "We're going to the school." The drive was a nightmare of torrential rain and blinding lightning. The streets were beginning to flood, the water swirling around the tires of her old sedan. By the time they reached the school, the power lines were sparking, and the campus was a dark, looming silhouette against the storm. Meredith bypassed the main gates and drove toward the back entrance near the loading docks. She used a heavy rock to shatter the glass of the side door, the sound swallowed by a crack of thunder. They slipped inside, the air smelling of floor wax and ozone. The hallways were a maze of shadows, the only light coming from the occasional flicker of emergency exit signs. They reached the computer lab, the door propped open as if Thorne was expecting them. Inside, the room was a forest of glowing monitors. Aris Thorne sat at his desk, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of a server rack. He didn't look like a teacher anymore. He looked like a man who had finally shed a skin that didn't fit. "Meredith," he said, his voice smooth and mocking. "I have to admire the persistence. Most people would have folded after the bank accounts. But you? You're like a stubborn infection. You just won't clear up." Why, Iris? Meredith asked, her hand tightening on the strap of her bag. Caleb was your best student. He looked up to you. Thorne laughed, a dry, hollow sound. Caleb was a convenience. The school district needed a scapegoat for the security breaches, and he was perfect. Quiet, tech-savvy, a father with a complicated history. And while everyone was looking at him, I was making a fortune selling vacant scholarship spots to parents who have more money than brains. It was a perfect system. Until you started digging. He stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the room. But the storm is going to take care of everything. A power surge, a corrupted server, and a forged confession from a disgraced nurse who couldn't handle the pressure of her son's failure. He moved faster than Meredith expected. He lunged across the desk, grabbing a thick, braided computer cable. Before she could react, he looped it around her neck, pulling it tight. Meredith gasped, her hands flying to her throat as the cable bit into her skin. "You're going to be the tragedy of the week, Meredith," Thorne hissed in her ear. The mother who broke. The world began to gray at the edges. Meredith felt the familiar rush of hypoxia, the panic of a body being denied air. But her training kicked in, the cold, clinical focus that had saved 100 lives. She didn't claw at the cable. She reached back, her fingers finding the cluster of nerves just below Thorne's jawline. She pressed her thumb in with all the strength of a woman who spent her days lifting patients. Thorne let out a choked cry of pain, his grip loosening as his arm went numb. Meredith twisted away, gasping for air, her lungs burning. She didn't run. She turned and struck him again, a sharp, precise blow to the solar plexus that sent him reeling back against his server rack. "Caleb, the console!" she shouted, but Thorne was already recovering. He lunged for the main terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "It's too late," he screamed over the roar of the wind outside. "I've initiated the wipe. Everything goes, the logs, the backups, and your little confession goes straight to the CPD." On the monitor, a progress bar appeared. Wipe initiated. 80%, 85%. Suddenly, a massive bolt of lightning hit the school's transformer. The building groaned as the electrical surge hit the grid. The emergency systems, sensing a breach, malfunctioned. With a heavy, mechanical thud, the electronic shutters on the windows and doors slammed shut, locking them into the lightless, airless lab. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic beep of the UPS backup power. They were trapped. Thorne looked at the screen, a manic grin on his face. "We're locked in, Meredith, and the upload is still going. You can't stop it now." Meredith sat on the floor of the darkened lab, the sound of her own ragged breathing filling the space. Outside, the police sirens were getting closer, their wails cutting through the roar of the storm. She looked at the monitor. Upload, 95%. In less than a minute, she would be a fugitive, and Caleb's life would be over. She looked at her nursing bag, the trauma shears, the stethoscope, and then she saw it. The portable manual defibrillator she'd grabbed from the ER's emergency kit during their flight. It was a rugged, battery-operated unit designed for field use. "Caleb," she whispered. "The override. Remember what I told you about the hospital's emergency locks? Everything has a fail-safe, a manual bypass." "Mom, that's for medical equipment," Caleb said, his voice trembling. "The school system is encrypted." "Not the physical locks," Meredith said. She stood up, her legs shaky but her mind clear. She walked over to the shutter control panel near the door. It was a high-voltage unit, tied directly into the school's emergency grid. She turned on the defibrillator. The machine hummed to life, a low, steady drone. Aris, you think you're the only one who knows how to manipulate a system? I deal with systems every day. Cardiovascular, respiratory, electrical, and they all respond to the same thing, a shock. She placed the paddles against the control panel's circuitry. Clear, she shouted, a grim echo of her life in the ER. She hit the button. A massive arc of blue electricity jumped from the paddles to the panel. The air filled with the smell of ozone and toasted plastic. The control panel exploded in a shower of sparks, the internal relays screaming as they were overloaded. With a groan of protesting metal, the shutters began to shudder, lifting just a few inches before the gears jammed. Go, Caleb, get out. Not without you. Meredith turned back to Thorne, who was staring at the screen in disbelief. The upload had stalled at 99%. The power surge had scrambled the transmission. You think you've won? Thorne snarled, reaching for a heavy glass award on his desk. I'll just restart it. No, you won't, Meredith said. She didn't flee through the gap in the shutters. She picked up a heavy office chair and smashed it into the primary monitor. Crash. Then the secondary. Crash. Stop it, Thorne screamed, lunging for her. That's $1 million of hardware. Then stop me, Aris, Meredith taunted, swinging the chair again. Use your master code. Lock the system down. Prove you're the genius you say you are. Thorne fell for it. His ego, the very thing that had allowed him to ruin a child's life for profit, couldn't handle the destruction of his kingdom. He scrambled to the master console, his fingers blurring as he entered his high-level administrative override, the God code that bypassed every security protocol in the building. I've got you now, he hissed, hitting the final key. Meredith stopped swinging the chair. She looked at Caleb, who was holding his laptop, his eyes wide. Did you get it? Got it, Caleb whispered. What? Thorne spun around, his face pale. What did you do? I didn't do anything, Aris, Meredith said, her voice calm and cold. You did. That override doesn't just lock the hardware. It's patched into the district's emergency mass notification system, the one for school shootings and hurricanes. You just opened a live audio and video feed to every parent, board member, and police officer in the city. Thorne looked at the small camera mounted on the server rack. The little red light was blinking, and since you were so proud of your perfect system, Meredith continued, I think they'd love to hear how you sold those scholarships. Why don't you tell them again? For the record. Thorne's face went from white to a sickly, mottled gray. He looked at the camera, then at the door, where the sound of heavy boots was now echoing in the hallway. The police weren't there for Meredith anymore. They had been listening to the God-complex rant of a man who thought he was untouchable. The door burst open, the hinges groaning as the officers forced their way in. They didn't look at Meredith. They tackled Thorne to the ground, the sound of handcuffs clicking shut the sweetest noise Meredith had ever heard. An hour later, the storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cool. Meredith and Caleb stood by the car, watching as Thorne was led away in the back of a cruiser. The school board president, a man who had ignored Meredith's calls for days, was now stammering apologies, promising a full restoration of Caleb's standing. Meredith didn't listen. She just looked at Caleb. He looked exhausted, his hair a mess, his hoodie stained with rain and dust. But his eyes were clear. The slump in his shoulders was gone. They drove home in silence, the city of Charleston slowly waking up to the scandal that would dominate the news for months. When they reached their house, the smart lock was still broken, the door hanging slightly ajar. Meredith walked into the kitchen. She didn't look at the thermostat or the TV. She walked over to the wall and gripped the router's power cable. With one sharp tug, she pulled it from the socket. The flickering lights on the box died instantly. Mom? Caleb asked from the doorway. Meredith sat down at the table, the quiet of the house wrapping around them like a blanket. Let's just sit here for a while, Caleb, she said, her voice soft and weary. In the dark, where it's quiet. Caleb sat down across from her. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers steady. They sat there together, two survivors of a digital war, realizing that while the world was back online, the only connection that mattered was the one that didn't require a password. The front door of their trust would take time to repair, but for the first time in years, the air in the house felt like it belonged to them.